He knew he was dying, but the worst was yet to come. Because if you touched a stranger's hand, you would relive the last 3 seconds before the death of anyone you touched. Now the question is, how do you live knowing that, with each contact, your own death is closer? If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Tell us about your stories and where you're watching from. The doctor's words echoed in Leonardo's mind like a distant drum, each one a heavy blow that shattered what was left of his hope. "You have only a few months to live, Mr. Hart." The terminal diagnosis had come quickly, like a slap to the face. He had always known that the illness gnawing at his body was serious, but hearing it confirmed, cold and final, was like standing at the edge of a cliff, peering into the abyss below. A rare, incurable disease. His body was deteriorating cell by cell, and soon even the most basic functions would fail. All he had left were memories of a life he was about to lose. Yet, amid the haze of despair, there was something, an ember of hope. The experimental treatment. It had been offered to him by a doctor he'd never met before, a man with a slightly manic gleam in his eyes and a certainty in his voice that felt almost otherworldly. The promise was simple: a chance to reverse the damage, to buy back what had been stolen from him. Against his better judgment and with nothing to lose, Leonardo agreed to the treatment. The procedure was strange, invasive. They injected him with a serum that burned like fire as it spread through his veins. He felt alive for the first time in weeks, as though a spark had been reignited deep inside him. But then, as quickly as it had come, the sensation faded, leaving a hollow sense of uncertainty behind. Still, the worst had passed, or so he thought. A few days after the treatment, something began to change. It started small, subtle. He brushed against someone in the hallway, a random stranger, and suddenly, he was no longer in control of his body. The room around him blurred, replaced by a vision so vivid that it felt as if it were happening to him. He saw a man, frail and shaking, desperately gasping for breath. His eyes widened in horror as the life left his body, the final moments a twisted display of pain and fear. It only lasted 3 seconds. Leonardo stumbled back, clutching his head. He'd felt it. The death. The absolute finality of it, the terror, the pain. He was gasping for air himself, as though it had happened to him. "What the hell?" he muttered, his hands shaking. His pulse raced. What had just happened? The world around him came back into focus, and the stranger was gone. But the sensation lingered. That moment. That death. Leonardo tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just a hallucination, a side effect of the treatment. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized it hadn't been a hallucination at all. It was real. A few days later, it happened again. This time, he barely touched a colleague's shoulder, but the moment their skin made contact, the vision flashed before him, a woman gasping, struggling as her life slipped away in her final seconds. This time, however, something was different. He was no longer an observer. He felt her fear, her desperation. The death wasn't just a vision, it was inside him. Leonardo stumbled back, his breath coming in short gasps. His heart pounded in his chest, and he suddenly understood. This was no simple side effect. He was reliving the last moments of someone's life. Something dark and dangerous was happening to him, and he had no idea why. He needed answers. Fast. As he struggled to regain his composure, a hand brushed against his arm. He froze. A flash of death. His own death flashed before his eyes. Leonardo couldn't shake the images that had been burned into his mind. The moments of death. Too real, too visceral. He tried to move on with his life, tried to tell himself it was just a side effect of the treatment, but the visions kept coming. It wasn't just the brief flash of death he saw. It was the feeling of it, the suffocating panic that coursed through his veins each time. He couldn't escape it. And every time he touched someone, he was pulled deeper into the cycle. He had learned quickly to avoid physical contact. No more handshakes, no more casual bumps in the hallway. But even then, the touch of someone's hand, even brushing against them for a split second, was enough to trigger the relentless flood of death. At first, it was just an inconvenience, an unsettling experience that he could write off as a bizarre side effect. But as the days wore on, it became something far worse, something darker. Each time, the deaths grew more vivid, more personal. And as the cycle continued, something inside him began to shift. He was no longer just an observer. He was feeling it. The terror, the suffocation, the final breath. He began to question himself. Was he being haunted by the souls of the dead? Or was the treatment, whatever it was, breaking his mind, forcing him to live through these violent, horrifying deaths until he couldn't tell reality from the visions anymore? One night, after another day of disturbing flashes, Leonardo found himself pacing the empty corridors of his apartment building. The lights flickered overhead, the hum of the neon bulbs creating a low, persistent buzz in his ears. His head throbbed from the constant bombardment of death. He had to know what was happening to him. He had to find answers. But he wasn't ready for what came next. Turning a corner, he collided with someone. His body froze. That familiar sensation, the cold rush of death filling his senses as their skin made contact. This time, it wasn't just a random person. It was someone he knew. Maya. Maya was a friend from his therapy group. She was the one person he'd felt comfortable with in weeks. They'd spent hours together talking about their shared experiences with the treatment, both of them hoping it would work, hoping for something to change. But in the moment their hands met, something in her eyes changed. There was a sudden flicker of recognition. No, Leonardo's vision blurred as he felt the pressure of Maya's last moments, just like the others. But there was something else, something worse. Instead of just dying in the flash of the moment, he felt her panic, her raw, primal fear. She wasn't dying. She was terrified of something else. For a split second, he saw a shadowy figure standing in the distance, lurking in the darkness behind her. A presence he couldn't fully make out, but the air felt thick with dread. He tried to pull away, but it was too late. The moment stretched on, torturing him with the echo of her final seconds. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was gone. Maya was standing in front of him, her expression a mixture of concern and confusion. "Leonardo?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. "Are you okay?" He blinked rapidly, the room snapping, back into focus. The shadowy figure was gone, but something was different. The chill that had washed over him lingered, and the memory of that presence, that thing behind Maya, gnawed at him. "No," he whispered. "I'm not okay." As the days went on, the visions became worse. The deaths, the terror, the suffocating feeling of being trapped in someone else's last breath. And always there was the shadow. Leonardo couldn't ignore it anymore. Something wasn't right. There was a connection between the deaths. And it wasn't just the treatment. Someone, or something, was pulling him deeper into this nightmare. But there was one question that kept rising above all others. Who was behind it? As Leonardo tried to understand the connection, the lights flickered again. He turned toward the door, hearing a soft scratching noise from the other side. Someone, or something, was waiting. The scratching sound outside the door grew louder, more insistent. Leonardo's heart raced as he stood frozen in place, the low hum of the flickering lights almost deafening in the silence that followed. He stepped cautiously toward the door, his fingers trembling as he gripped the handle. Who was there? He didn't know what he expected. Another stranger? A shadow? But when he opened the door, there was nothing. Just the empty hallway stretching out before him, dark and quiet. The air felt colder than it had moments before, and for a brief moment, he wondered if he'd imagined the noise, but he knew better than that. His skin prickled as if the very walls were watching him, listening. He shut the door quickly and leaned against it, trying to steady his breath. No. Something was wrong. As he walked back into the apartment, He caught sight of his reflection in the mirror near the door. The faint glow of the overhead light cast long shadows across his face, making his features look distorted. Alien. The man staring back at him looked tired, broken. Leonardo's eyes locked on his own reflection, and for a moment he couldn't look away. It was as if something deep within him was pulling him closer to the glass. Something was different. Wrong. He reached out a hand, his fingers brushing against the cool surface of the mirror. And then in an instant, the world around him shifted. The reflection didn't change. It stayed the same, but his vision did. In the mirror, the man himself wasn't just standing there. He was choking. His eyes bulged in terror, his mouth open in a silent scream. Leonardo's own reflection was suffocating, gasping for air, struggling in vain to breathe as if drowning in an invisible force. He pulled his hand back, staggering away from the mirror, his breath ragged and shallow. That wasn't supposed to be possible. He couldn't have seen that, but it wasn't just a vision. He felt it too, the suffocation, the panic. No, this was different. This was a vision of his own death. As he backed away from the mirror, gasping for breath, something else caught his attention. A figure standing in the reflection, just behind him. A shadowy outline of a person, but not quite human. Its form was twisted, its features hidden by an unnatural darkness. It was standing there, silent, watching him. He turned quickly, but there was nothing behind him. Only the empty apartment. Yet the sense of being watched didn't fade. He felt it. This presence that loomed just outside his perception, like it was always there waiting. Panic surged through him. He was losing control. His mind raced, the terror mounting. What was that thing? Was it connected to the treatment? Was it trying to take him? Or was he already dead? Leonardo couldn't stop the questions from flooding his mind, but none of them brought him answers. He grabbed his phone, ready to call Maya, to reach out to someone who might make sense of all of this. But just as his fingers hovered over the screen, the phone buzzed in his hand. A message. It was from Maya. "We need to talk. I know what's happening to you." His stomach dropped. He didn't have time to respond before another message appeared. "Meet me at the lab tomorrow night. I'll explain everything." Leonardo stared at the phone, his pulse racing. She knew? Without thinking, he sent a reply. "I'm coming." But as soon as the words were out of his mouth, the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't just flicker. They went out. The apartment was plunged into darkness, and from somewhere in the shadows he heard a faint whisper. "Leonardo." It was his name, but it wasn't his own voice. It was low, distorted, like it came from someone, or something, else entirely. His breath caught in his throat. He had to get out of there. He had to find answers. Before it was too late. The whisper grew louder, now right behind him. He spun around, but no one was there. Just the darkness. The air felt thick, suffocating. And then, the shadow from the mirror appeared in the corner of the room, moving, its outline stretching unnaturally. Leonardo's heart pounded in his chest as the whisper echoed through the apartment. The darkness around him felt alive, pressing in on him from all sides. The shadow in the corner of the room moved, slithering across the walls like it was made of smoke, shifting and contorting. It wasn't natural. It wasn't real. And yet, it was. He backed away from the corner, his mind racing, trying to process what was happening. It was impossible. Was this part of the treatment? Some side effect he hadn't been warned about? Or was this something more sinister? Something that had been waiting for him all along? The whispering grew louder, coming from every direction now. "Leonardo." He turned toward the door, desperate to escape. But as his hand gripped the handle, a cold gust of air swept through the apartment, slamming it shut before he could open. It was then that he noticed something strange, a shape in the darkness. It wasn't a shadow this time, it was a figure, tall and thin, standing just out of reach of the light. And yet, despite the distance, its eyes seemed to shine. Bright, white, almost blinding. Leonardo froze. The figure wasn't moving, but its gaze was fixed on him, piercing through the darkness with an unnatural intensity. He couldn't look away. It was like it was pulling him in, drawing him closer, and every instinct in his body screamed to run, but he couldn't move. It knows me. The thought cut through his mind with the force of a hammer. This thing, it wasn't just a manifestation of his fear. It wasn't a hallucination. It knew him. It knew his name. And it wanted something. The air felt heavy. He was suffocating, trapped in that small room with the thing that was watching him. He reached for his phone, hands trembling, and texted Maya again. "Where is this lab? What is going on?" But before he could send the message, the figure in the corner twitched. It moved, faster than he could blink. And suddenly, it was right in front of him, standing in the middle of the room, its dark eyes inches from his own. The air grew colder still. His breath formed a fog in front of him as the thing's face twisted, contorting into something unrecognizable. Its features blurred and stretched, like a mask being pulled too tight, until it settled into a grotesque smile. "You shouldn't have come," the figure whispered, its voice a hiss, a rasp, like nails scraping against glass. In an instant, Leonardo shoved past it, stumbling back toward the door. He didn't stop to look back. He couldn't. He had to get out. He had to find answers, and if Maya knew something, he was going to find out what it was. As he opened the door, a hand shot out from the darkness, grabbing his wrist with an iron grip. The voice came again, now louder, more insistent. "You're not ready. It's already too late." Leonardo's heart slammed against his chest as the cold fingers tightened around his wrist, pulling him back into the room. The grip was unnaturally strong, as if it wasn't human at all. His pulse quickened and panic flooded his veins. He yanked at his arm, but the hand didn't loosen. If anything, it pulled him closer. No. No. This can't be real. His breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped into the light, its face now fully visible. It wasn't human, not anymore. The features were jagged, distorted, and twisted. Too many eyes, too many mouths. The skin stretched taut and raw, like it was pulled over something far worse. The thing smiled again, but it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was a smile of hunger. "You can't escape," it whispered. The words were like a cold gust of wind, freezing his very soul. Leonardo's pulse roared in his ears. His mind raced for a way out. Maya, the lab. I need to get to the lab. With every ounce of strength he had left, he twisted free of the thing's grasp, stumbling backward toward the door. The figure didn't chase him. Instead, it just stood there, watching, waiting. "You'll never escape." It hissed again, the voice more distant now, fading like a whisper on the wind. He didn't have time to process what had just happened. He didn't have time for anything except to run. In a blur, he rushed out the door, slamming it behind him. But as soon as the hallway light hit his face, he froze. There, at the end of the corridor, stood Maya. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes wide but not with concern. She was waiting for him. She knew he was coming. And for a split second, he wondered if she had been part of all this from the beginning. "Leonardo," she said softly, her voice low but calm. "I told you to come." Leonardo's pulse skipped a beat. How did she know? How could she be so calm when everything felt like it was spiraling out of control? He swallowed hard. He had to know what was going on, what was really happening. He stepped toward her, his voice trembling. "Maya. What's happening? What is all of this?" he demanded. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a step closer to him, her face still unreadable. Then, in a voice almost too soft to hear, she whispered, "It's not the treatment, Leo. It's not the serum, it's the lab." Leonardo's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, as if speaking any louder might shatter the fragile moment. Maya hesitated for a long moment, then spoke again, her eyes darkening. "The lab wasn't just testing a cure, They were testing something else. Something they shouldn't have. Before he could ask another question, she motioned for him to follow. "Come with me. I'll explain everything. But we need to go now. There's no time." Leonardo's mind was spinning, trying to make sense of everything. What was she talking about? What was the lab really doing? He glanced back over his shoulder, half expecting the thing to appear again in the hallway. But the corridor was empty. Still, the sense of dread clung to him like a second skin. As they walked, Maya led him down a series of hallways, each one darker and more ominous than the last. The silence was suffocating, and the air felt thick with an oppressive weight. But Leonardo could barely focus on anything except the gnawing fear that continued to gnaw at him. They reached a door at the end of the hall, one that appeared to be locked. Maya quickly punched in a code, and the door clicked open with a metallic hiss. They stepped inside, and Leonardo's breath caught in his throat. The lab was like something out of a nightmare. The walls were lined with strange equipment, machines he couldn't even begin to understand. But what drew his attention was the large tank in the center of the room. Inside the tank was something. It was moving, shifting in the murky water, but it was impossible to see clearly. All he could make out were vague shapes, distorted limbs, twisted forms. This is what they were working on? Leonardo whispered, his voice shaking. Maya didn't respond at first. She just stared at the tank with a haunted look in her eyes. Then, with a deep breath, she spoke. "It's not just a treatment. It's a gateway." The tank began to ripple violently as if something inside it was struggling to break free. A low guttural sound echoed through the lab. And then, without warning, a pair of eyes, not human, opened from within the murk, staring directly at Leonardo. Leonardo's breath caught in his throat as the eyes, unnatural eyes, stared at him from the murky depths of the tank. The pupils were elongated, distorted, a sickly yellow that glowed faintly in the dim light of the lab. They locked onto him, and for a moment he was frozen, unable to look away. The thing inside the tank shifted again, its form barely visible through the murky water, but the movement was unmistakable. It was large, far larger than any human being, and as it twisted in the tank, the sound of scraping, grinding metal echoed throughout the room. The water around it rippled violently, as though the creature was pressing against the walls of its prison, trying to break free. Maya stood frozen next to him, her face pale, her eyes wide with a fear that mirrored his own. She didn't speak, didn't move, as if she was waiting for something. What is that?" Leonardo finally managed to choke out, his voice barely above a whisper. Maya's voice trembled as she spoke. "I told you the lab was hiding something. They weren't just testing treatments on us. They were experimenting with them." Leonardo's mind spun, his pulse racing. "Them? What the hell are you talking about?" Before Maya could respond, the tank shuddered again, and with a deafening crash, one of the walls buckled, the metal bending outward as the creature inside pushed harder. The water sloshed violently, spilling out of the tank in torrents. The room was filled with the sound of splashing water, the hiss of the pressure being released, and the sickening creaking of the tank's frame, barely holding together. Leonardo took a step back, heart hammering in his chest. "Maya, what's happening?" Maya's eyes were locked on the tank, her body tense. "It's been contained for years. They never expected it to be this strong. I didn't think it could break free." Leonardo felt a surge of dread course through him. What the hell had they been dealing with in this lab? The creature inside the tank surged again, its shape now visible in the water. It was enormous, far too large for the tank, its limbs long and unnatural, ending in clawed fingers that scraped at the tank's walls. Its skin was slick, slimy, a grotesque mix of black and gray. The more Leonardo looked, the more he saw. The thing wasn't human. It wasn't even alive in the way he understood. It was something else. Something ancient. Something hungry. With a final terrifying screech, the creature tore through the remaining walls of the tank, sending shards of glass and metal flying through the air. Water flooded the room, spilling across the floor as the creature freed itself, its massive form now fully exposed. The lab lights flickered violently as the creature rose to its full height, its eyes locked on Leonardo. He couldn't move. His body was paralyzed with fear, his legs trembling as if his very bones had turned to stone. Maya gasped, stepping back. "We have to go. Now." But as she turned to run, the creature's eyes fixed on her, and in a split second, it moved. It was impossibly fast, its body rippling with unnatural strength as it lunged toward her. Leonardo's instincts kicked in. Without thinking, he reached out and grabbed Maya's arm, pulling her away just as the creature's claws swiped through the air, missing them by inches. They stumbled backward, the creature's screeches filling their ears as it slammed into the metal tables, tearing them apart in a frenzy. The ground shook with its every movement. "What is it?" Leonardo shouted, his voice desperate as he pulled Maya toward the door. "What does it want?" Maya's eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else there too. Guilt. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice shaking. "This thing, it's been trying to break free for years. It's the reason you're having the visions. It's the reason you're seeing the deaths." Leonardo's mind reeled. "What? You mean it's causing this? It's causing the deaths? But how?" Maya's face hardened, her expression dark. "The lab, they created it. They didn't just unlock some cure. They opened a door to something else, something that shouldn't exist." The creature roared behind them, its body thrashing as it tore through the lab, knocking over equipment, sending sparks flying. The sound of metal on metal was deafening. Without warning, Maya grabbed Leonardo by the arm and dragged him down a side corridor, her pace quickening. "Where are we going?" Leonardo gasped, still struggling to keep up. "To the exit. If we're lucky, we can get out before it's too late." She glanced back over her shoulder, fear in her eyes. "It's not just the lab, Leo, it's everything. We're not safe, not anymore." As they rounded the corner, a new sound echoed through the hall, a slow, deliberate tapping, like footsteps. But they weren't alone anymore. Someone, or something, else was in the lab with them. The air was thick with dread as Leonardo and Maya sprinted down the dark corridor, the sounds of the creature's rampage growing fainter behind them. They didn't stop to look back, not even once. Every step, every breath was a race against time. The door at the end of the hall loomed ahead like a distant hope, but it felt farther away with each passing second. Maya's grip tightened around his wrist as they reached the door. She punched in a code quickly, and the door clicked open with an eerie hiss. They rushed inside, but just as the door shut behind them, a chill washed over Leonardo. He could feel the eyes of something, someone, watching them from the shadows. Before he could react, the door slammed shut behind them with a force that rattled the walls. "What the hell?" Leonardo gasped, turning to Maya. But Maya's face had gone pale, her eyes wide with terror. "It's too late. We shouldn't have come. Here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They know you're here now." Leonardo's mind raced. Who? Who knows? But before she could answer, the walls around them began to shift. The metal doors that lined the room rattled, the lights flickering. A deep, rumbling sound vibrated through the air, like something massive moving just beyond their reach. And then they heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps, slow, deliberate, and purposeful, coming from the opposite side of the room. Maya froze, her body rigid with fear. "It's them," she breathed. "They're here." Leonardo felt his pulse quicken. Who? What? Suddenly the tapping stopped. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of his own breathing. He could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him, the walls closing in, the air growing, colder by the second. And then, from the darkness, a figure stepped forward. It was tall, dressed in a long black coat, a face obscured by the shadows. But the moment Leonardo saw the figure's eyes, his blood ran cold. They were the same eyes, the same unnatural eyes he had seen in the lab, the creature, the thing in the tank. The figure stepped closer and Leonardo felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. The figure's presence felt like a weight on his chest, suffocating him. "You shouldn't have come," The figure whispered in a voice that sounded like 100 voices layered over one another. "You should have stayed away." Maya's hand tightened around his, and for the first time Leonardo saw fear, real fear, in her eyes. The figure stepped closer still, its eyes glowing with that same malevolent light. The world around them seemed to distort, bending and warping like a fever dream. The air crackled with static, and for a moment, Leonardo couldn't tell if he was awake or if he had already crossed over to the other side. "It's not the treatment," the figure continued, its voice now a growl, deep and guttural. "It's not the serum, it's you. All of you. You've been part of the experiment all along. This is the end, Leo. The end of everything." Leonardo's mind swirled with confusion, panic clawing at him from every direction. No. This can't be happening. This can't be real. But as the figure stepped forward again, its eyes locked onto his, he understood. The truth. The final truth. The lab wasn't just a place for experiments, it wasn't just a place of science, it was a gateway, a doorway between worlds, and the thing in the tank wasn't just some test subject. It was the key to something far darker, something far more terrifying than anything he could have imagined. The figure's hand reached out, fingers brushing against his cheek, and in that instant Leonardo was flooded with a vision, no, a memory, of the last 3 seconds of his life. He saw himself, dead, lying on the cold floor, eyes wide with fear, as the darkness consumed him. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the realization that those 3 seconds weren't just his own. They were everyone's last 3 seconds, the deaths of countless souls who had touched him, who had given him this curse. And now it was his turn. The figure's smile widened, its teeth sharp and predatory. It whispered one final word and the darkness closed in around him. Now. Cliffhanger. As the figure's hand touched Leonardo's chest, the world seemed to fracture. He could feel himself dying, the life draining from him. But then, in the final second before everything went black, the door behind him flew open. A light, a voice, and the sound of footsteps. Real footsteps, rushing toward him. What did you think of the story? Did it keep you on the edge of your seat until the end? If you enjoyed Os Últimos 3 Segundos, don't forget to share this story with your friends, family, and fellow horror lovers. Leave a comment below and let me know your thoughts. I'd love to hear how the twists and turns kept you hooked. Stay tuned for more spine-chilling tales to come.